June 6, 1944. Normandy coast, the horizon grows teeth. We had built a wall and told ourselves it would teach the sea to behave. At first light, the water disagreed. The gray band between sky and surf thickened into silhouettes that multiplied faster than an officer could count. A rangefinder ticked through distances as if it were miscalibrated. Another man wiped its lens and found the numbers unchanged. In a casemate above Colleville-sur-Mer, powder dust ran in ripples along the concrete like a small animal trying to escape. The first salvos from the ships came with a long, sneering time of flight that made brave men feel briefly forgiven. And then the ground answered with a punch to the ribs that reminded us the Atlantic Wall was a promise measured in meters of concrete, not in miracles. We had rehearsed this morning for months on paper. The wall was a machine of intervals, trestles, and tetrahedra planted at tidal lines to gut a craft at 4 feet of water. Mine belts counted from the last low tide. Interlocking arcs from MG embrasures designed so that an infantryman could not walk a straight line for more than 10 seconds. Our gunners loved certainty. The MG-42 wrote certainty at roughly 1/200 rounds per minute, the belt slithering through gloved hands like a living thing. The 8.8-centimeter gun spat a shell at about 820 meters per second and did not care whether the target wore armor or canvas. Physics is impartial. The Regelbau forms on this sector were proud pieces of arithmetic walls, in places 2 meters thick roof beams that could ignore splinters and small shells all day. We believed thickness bought time. Time, we learned, was their main currency as well. Then we realized the sea was not bringing a single puzzle to solve, but many small ones that refused to share an answer. The first silhouettes to lurch from the chop near Hermanville looked like tanks wearing skirts, canvas screens that made them behave like boats. At Ouistreham, a drum of chains whirled on a squat machine and beat the sand like a mad drummer, mines coughing their sulfur into the morning. At Omaha, fate seemed briefly on our side, craft blown off course, men piled in lines of fire we had planned, with careful angles, obstacles doing exactly what our engineers had promised. And yet every failure on their part was replaced by another try, as if the sea itself were their reserve division. Eye level in the embrasure, the world was a slot. Surf, smoke, the thin upright of a ramp, a man falling as if his legs had been erased. The loader tapped my shoulder twice, once for ready, and once for you are shaking. The barrel hissed when the sea kissed it. We shifted to a new lane and the sight picture became not men, but movement, not targets, but a process that kept inventing more of them. Somewhere behind us, a radio whispered to a destroyer, and then an invisible fist probed the bunker, not a hit, but a reminder that someone offshore could reach into our room whenever a man with a handset asked politely. The first 24 hours will be decisive. For Germany, it will be the longest day. Rommel had said it before the storm wrecked his travel, and in the half hour after H-hour, it stopped sounding like prophecy and began feeling like a measurement. The day stretched in strange ways, seconds long enough to read your name in and then forget it. Minutes that collapsed when the ships spoke together, and the beach leaped upward in a brown sheet. Along the Caen road, the argument we had been having with ourselves, panzers held close for a quick strike or deeper for a measured counterattack, suddenly felt like a quarrel with the tide. Orders asked for clarity. The horizon gave us weather. The 716 Infantry Division reported enemy penetrations that were both shallow and everywhere a geometry that made maps look deceitful. When we finally saw our tanks from 21 Panzer Division nose toward the coast, between Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer, the sight was a blessing mistimed. Airplanes arrived in squadrons, not anecdotes, and the road that had seemed like an answer became a statement of vulnerability written in daylight and dust. We examined a knocked-out flail near Rivabella. In a lull that was not a lull, the drum-dented chain links welded to fragments of wire and seaweed. An engineer captain ran a finger along the linkage and said almost to the machine that the idea was heavier than the steel, take the blast, so a man may cross. He meant it as analysis, but I heard it as confession. We had built elegant problems. They had brought ugly solutions that did not need to be clever to be correct. By midday, the maps on the trestle table resembled a tide chart more than a plan. Our strong points still spat, some with admirable rhythm, others with a cough that meant belts were low and barrels tired. A single radio set on a bluff became a fulcrum whenever it could still speak. When a ship answered, you felt it in your teeth. In the bocage south of Bayeux, a Panzerfaust kept its intimate contract at 30 to 60 meters, and for a moment, a lane belonged to us again. But that was the rhythm of the afternoon brief certainties interrupted by larger processes. Their engineers cut a path. Their infantry filled it. Their radios thickened it with steel from beyond sight. Night promised nothing kind. Paratroopers we had tried to drown in fields and ditches still moved in our rear, tying confusions across junctions our fuel and orders needed. Offshore, the sound of engines layered the dark, a low ceiling of intent. We could still count our strengths concrete that had not cracked guns that still answered the trigger, like old friends' men whose fear had been organized into tasks. But the center of the problem had moved. We had wagered on a place. They had wagered on a schedule. The horizon, even in the failing light, kept its teeth. Under the wall and behind the map boards, the problem looked simple enough to write and impossible to solve. We had designed a coastline to punish straight lines obstacles calibrated to wreck a landing craft at the tidal fringe. Mines set to the rhythm of the moon. Embrasures crossing angles so that a man who stood too long in daylight became a number. That was our promise. The enemy's promise was different: arrive in depth repair, in motion and measure progress, not by perfect moments, but by how fast broken things could be made to work again. From our side, the stakes were blunt. If we could keep the first hours expensive, the second wave would arrive into wreckage and doubt. If we could keep armor poised to strike at the hinge Caen, and the Orne crossing's lodgements would stay thin enough to tear. If we failed, the beach would stop being a place and become a schedule we did not own. Our constraints began with distance and with phones. The coastal sectors lived on cable-buried lines, to batteries, to regimental posts, to observers whose only luxury was a dry handset. Naval shells did not need to kill a man to cut a conversation. Whenever a roof slid 2 inches or a wall coughed dust for too long, a position could still shoot, but could no longer speak, and without speech, the strongest bunker turned into a photograph. Radios filled the gaps, but sets were few and nets were thin. A single working station on a bluff could lever a destroyer off our backs if it found a cooperative operator and a quiet minute. A deadline turned a company's courage into a local story no one else could hear. Over us, the air belonged to someone else. You could feel that truth in the way columns moved, dispersed, hugging ditches, halting whenever engines approached that were not ours. We had argued where to keep the Panzers close for a fast blow at the beaches, or deeper for a measured counterattack, and found that both choices required minutes the sky refused to sell. Orders to move north looked sharp on a board. On the ground, they grew ragged, punctuated by dives that were not always lethal, but were always decisive about timing. Movement survived. Coordination bled out. Artillery wanted eyes. Ours had them in pieces. Forward observers worked from church towers, dunes, and casemate periscopes. Each vantage was a contract with luck. A sandblast could cloud a sight for a minute. A near miss could turn a perfect range into a smudge on a clipboard. Coastal batteries like Longue-sur-Mer still held their mathematics angles, charges range tables as tidy as winter, but the sea had learned to answer. When a salvo went short, the correction arrived faster than our wire could heal. In a landscape where a bunker roof could be 2 meters of reinforced concrete, what mattered was not whether the first hits broke it, but whether the fourth or the fifth arrived before a crew could breathe. The enemy's problem, as we saw it, was uglier and therefore stronger. They needed to land men open lanes, neutralize strong points, and link beaches into something that could feed itself inland. But they had brought an answer stitched to every step: engineers in the first waves, beating mines with chains and explosive hoses, radios, forward enough to converse with ships and guns we could not see, and armor that arrived in mismatched ways, some swimming on canvas screens, some grinding off ramps behind drifts of smoke so that failure in one method did not cancel the attempt. Where we loved a plan, they loved a process. Where we measured the wall in thickness, they measured their day in tries. Behind our front, the roads determined what counted as hope. A battalion commander knew that a single knocked-out lorry in a Norman lane could cancel 10 minutes of daylight. Hedgerows made strong statements about what you could see, They made weak promises about what you could do quickly. South of Bayeux and around Tilly-sur-Seulles, you learned why infantry still carried wire cutters and why a Panzerfaust at 30 to 60 meters felt like a fair bargain. Intimate distance, intimate risk. A tank that declared itself on a road declared itself to the sky. A squad that stalked through bocage declared itself only to the next 10 yards. In the command dugout, the boards divided the morning into sectors that did not behave like boundaries. Reports from 352 Infantry Division at Omaha said the waterline chewed men and craft, as intended, then added that new ramps kept dropping into the same ground as if the sea had memorized our angles and decided to ignore them. Eastward, Infantry Division counted unusual silhouettes, flails beating lanes at sword canvas-skirted tanks clawing toward Hermanville, and attached small verbs to large changes, lane cleared, wire-gapped, trench suppressed. Each verb felt temporary until you watched 3 of them in a row and understood the sequence was the point. Logistics whispered under every radio call. Ammunition in a casemate is a comfort until it becomes weight. A belt that feeds at roughly 100-200 rounds per minute does not care about your plan to make the day last. Water fouls oil. Sand chews through the ideas in a manual. Resupply meant men crossing ground that had already been measured by someone else's sights. Even success had a price in minutes. A barrel swap, a cooling pause, a walk back to the protected corner where the next box waited. We were not short of courage. We were short of frictionless minutes. Then there was the release paradox, the authority ladder just that decided when reserves could become action. A division could identify the hinge, a corps could agree, army group could refine the angle, and somewhere above all of that, a single decision could hold or free the speed we needed. On maps, the delay was a line. On roads, it was a shadow that lengthened as the morning brightened. By the time elements of 21 Panzer Division pushed toward Lyon-sur-Mer, and Luc-sur-Mer, the beaches were already less beach and more machine lanes. Beaten exits tested radios humming with a grammar we had not practiced. At eye level, the stakes arrived as small choices. Keep the gun on the broader lane or rake the sapper who is clearly about to earn his pay. Call for counter-battery and wait or shift position and trust that the next range correction will not find you. Send the runner for belts now or one volley from now. The wall held wherever men kept making those choices correctly. It failed wherever physics decided the conversation without asking our opinion. We understood the definition of defeat long before anyone dared to say the word. It did not require a rout or a collapsed front. It required the enemy to turn our coastline from a fortress into a schedule. If they could keep trying faster than we could reset, if their radios could pull steel down faster than our wires could be repaired, if their engineers could invent one more lane than we could close, then the arithmetic favored them, even in places where the ground looked unchanged. The problem each side was solving was not who owned a map square at noon, but who owned the next 10 minutes. And in the next 10 minutes, the sea always had more to send. The edge we felt pressing against the wall was not a single weapon, but a system whose pieces reinforced one another faster than we could break them apart. From the casemate slit, it arrived as silhouettes and smoke. Under the hood, it was engineering stacked on procedure naval guns that could be talked onto targets' radios that stayed alive under weather, and an engineer's toolkit designed to make our neat problems messy in seconds. Start with the sea. A destroyer's 5-inch battery throws a shell miles inland, but the number that punished us was smaller the distance it dared close when the shore party spoke clearly. In our sector, we watched escorts creep to within roughly 1,000 yards when the day demanded it switching to direct fire that ignored our careful defilades. The cycle time between a forward observer's call and steel arriving compressed until it felt like a reflex. When an embrasure coughed dust twice in a row, you learned that somewhere a man with a handset was drawing a line from your roof to a ship you could not see, and that line had become a habit. Concrete buys minutes, not immunity. 2 meters of reinforced roof respects the third heavy hit if the third arrives before your men can breathe. The radios were the spine of it. We had wire good buried and doomed once the first salvos walked the bluffs. They carried sets ashore in the first waves, and when those sets lived, the beach spoke to the fleet as if it were one organism. You could feel it in the cadence short-corrected bursts rather than broad blind barrages, salvos that walked a trench instead of a grid square. Our own nets thinned as cables died and aerials shook loose. A single working station could still lever a destroyer off our backs if it found a quiet minute. Too often the quiet minute belonged to someone else. Then came the tools that turned our diagrams into riddles. We had counted on mined belts and obstacles tuned to tide height stakes and steel that would gut a craft at about 4 feet of water, layered with pressure and contact surprises that rewarded timetables and punished improvisation. Their answers were built to insult that logic. A flail tank's drum-spinning chains into the sand converted a minefield's patient geometry into a shower of controlled detonations that cleared a lane wide enough for infantry to inherit. Bangalore sections and demolition hoses wrote quick sentences through wire we had knotted for a winter. The grammar was simple: open, pass, hold, expand, and it repeated until the wire was a memory rather than a plan. Even when a flail died in our sight, the idea did not die with it. Another crew took the same lane because the process assumed loss and paid for it ahead of time. Armor arrived in mismatched ways that blunted our specific counters. DD tanks used canvas skirts and propellers to turn water into road for just long enough to matter. We saw some perish on chop and current. We saw enough live to understand the wager. Others came in behind smoke on standard ramps, engines loud and patient, asking only that the engineers do their work first. The variety meant our successes diluted themselves. We could be right in one lane and irrelevant in the next. When a gunner reported tank in water, the mind reflexively reached for the wrong drawer. That hesitation measured itself in seconds, and seconds were the currency of this morning. Air sat over every calculation like a pressure you couldn't see. Movement that looked crisp on a situation map softened on the ground, under aircraft that arrived in squadrons rather than anecdotes. A column that declared itself on a road, declared itself to the sky, and even a near miss could disassemble coordination by stealing the next 5 minutes from your watch. Our release doctrine for reserve armor, careful, layered, and in peacetime very sensible, hit the friction of this weather and this enemy, and became delay. By the time elements of our panzers pushed toward the coast, the beaches had stopped being lines and started being machines, ons, beaten exits, tested radios humming with a syntax we had not practiced. Artillery remained the adult in every room until it lost its eyes. Forward observation from spires, dunes, and periscopes worked until the first 2 corrections from the sea arrived faster than our wiremen could splice. Longues-sur-Mer and other batteries solved their trigonometry correctly. The ocean solved the conversation faster. We could still hurt what we could still see, but the enemy had detached seeing from being seen, and that asymmetry leaked into every choice: keep the gun on the broad lane, or rake the sapper who is obviously about to earn his pay. Hold fire for the tank, or spend a belt on the team with the handset that will call the ship. At eye level, you noticed small physics that don't travel on staff maps. MG-42 barrels heat in a known curve. At roughly 200 rounds per minute, the pause to swap is both short and eternal when a destroyer is correcting onto your roof. A Panzerfaust in hedgerow country is honest work at 30 to 60 meters. Honest work costs time, and time is what the lane buys for the man behind the sapper. Water fouls oil. Sand chews through manuals. A belt is weight until it is life, and then it is weight again. Our system needed smooth minutes to move ammunition from cool stacks to hot chambers. Their system needed only one more working radio than we could silence. We examined a captured set of their beach signals, panels, flares, and clipped codes scribbled on a waterproof card during a lull that was only a lull because someplace else was screaming. Nothing elegant, everything robust. A sign that could tell a shipshift left 20 yards had more power over our morning than any single gun short of a battleship. When those signals lived, you felt it in the way salvos began to anticipate your next move instead of merely answer your last one. Put the parts together, and the picture clarifies. Our numbers, roof thickness in meters, bunker spacing in yards, fields of fire crossing at known angles, promised that a straight walk in daylight would be punished. Their numbers call for fire cycles measured in heartbeats, engineer clearance rates measured in lanes per hour. A destroyer's willingness to come to within 1,000 yards, when a voice ashore was steady, promised that the punishment would be endured long enough to produce a path. The wall was a place. They turned it into a process. And processes once running are harder to stop than to complain about. The morning did not break. It thickened. Between salvos, we learned to count by instincts how long a runner could live in the open, how many words a radio could speak before the next correction walked in from the sea. Our embrasure became a stubborn eye that refused to blink. Each time we shifted lanes, the beach had invented a new problem, a lane of pale sand where dark sand had been a strip of stakes, leaning as if something had chewed them. A knot of men flattened by fire until the instant a flail tank beat the ground into obedience and the knot uncoiled. On our left, a casemate that had been bragging all morning fell silent in a breath and a half. We felt the hit before we heard it, air leaving the room, pressure slapping the cheeks, then dust peeling from concrete like old paint. The loader tapped my shoulder with a rhythm that meant both ready and don't look away. The barrel kissed surf again and hissed like a snake. Farther west, smoke pulled sideways and showed ramps lowering where no ramps should have survived. We stitched that lane until the belt clanged dry. When the new belt seeded, the lane already had a shape. We did not like the shape of men crawling, who had learned exactly how long to stay still. Then we realized the enemy was testing us the way an engineer tests a bridge, one axle at a time, then two, then a full truck. A sapper team crept to our wire, died exactly where our diagrams predicted, and was replaced by another that crawled 20 meters left and lived long enough to place their charge. A tank rolled forward until our 8.8 signed its opinion at roughly 820 meters per second. The next tank paused at the same range, waited for smoke, and chose the shadow of a dune where our traverse was ugly. Their learning curve looked like arrogance until you noticed the pacing, small trials, immediate corrections, no mourning for a tactic that failed. We took a prisoner just after 10 Caen. One of their engineers, mud to his helmet, eyes salt-burnt. He shook alone on the floor of the dugout, while the captain asked for signals panels, flares, what colors meant what. The man kept staring at the map where our exits were penciled. When he finally spoke, it was about time, not terrain. He said their job was to buy minutes for the next platoon, and that the next platoon would buy minutes for armor. He didn't say when. He said keep the schedule fed. The captain wrote this down as if it were theater, but the words stayed in the room like cordite. Outside, we examined a drowned canvas screen torn from a DD tank that hadn't made its bargain with the chop. The fabric was oil sour and grit rough stiff where the frame had buckled. The mechanic with us tapped the propeller housing and did the arithmetic allowed enough thrust on a quiet day, not today, but the idea didn't need to work every time. It only needed to work enough. We had loved thresholds, ranges, thicknesses, the comfort of numbers that declared yes or no. They were playing percentages and could afford a long series. By noon, the map looked like a lung beaches, breathing in men inland hedgerows, exhaling small fights that found us at the worst moments. Pointe du Hoc on our right became a rumor that hardened into a fact. Men had climbed the impossible cliff and were now somewhere behind where we had drawn them. South of Bayeux, Panzerfaust teams did honest work at 30 to 60 meters, the kind of distance you can smell. Lanes closed under courage and reopened under a second wave that behaved as if the first had existed only to measure our timing. When an exit track at Omaha dared the bluff, we punished it hard and watched another appear 5 minutes later, not in defiance but in careful imitation of whatever had almost worked last time. Air kept its thumb on the clock. The first time a flight of fighter bombers came low over the Caen road, the column flattened into hedges and ditches and shadows. Not many were hit. Many were delayed. The second time, the same pilots or their doubles found the same road and the same reflex. Delay multiplied. Orders which had been nouns in the dugout became verbs on the ground, scatter, halt, wait, and each verb paid in minutes we didn't own. When elements of 21 Panzer finally reached between Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer, the surf acknowledged them with light, and the sky punished them with attention. They turned back with engines that sounded like coughing arguments. The battery at Longues-sur-Mer tried to reassert adulthood range tables, correct corrections crisp, but the ocean had learned to think in shorter loops. A salvo that landed near enough to frighten us was near enough to draw an answer we could not silence. Wires that had taken months to lay took seconds to die. Our remaining sets worked like fulcrums when the net was quiet, and the net was seldom quiet for long. Then we realized something we should have written on the board in red: our successes were local and fleeting, unless they chained into a schedule of our own. A machine gun that held a lane for 6 minutes meant nothing if the runner with belts arrived at 7. A counterattack that touched the sea meant little if it touched it at the wrong minute. Even courage had a timing window. We had treated time as the background of our plan. For them, time was the plan. In the embrasure, the day narrowed to the width of a sight. A figure lifted a handset and vanished in a rainfall of sand, the ship's reply already in the air before our objection finished forming. A flail's drum slowed, shuddered, stopped. A second flail inherited the lane like a relay baton. The loader passed me another belt, and in that automatic gesture there was a prayer neither of us would speak. Concrete still held. The gun still answered. Men still did what manuals ask, but the field felt tilted, and not by a map feature. It was tilted by a metronome. Toward evening, the smoke turned the sun into a coin you could stare at. We worked in that counterfeit dusk, raking where movement suggested nerve rather than need, husbanding belts, not by count, but by breath. Somewhere to our east, the bridges over the Orne still refused to decide who owned them. Somewhere to our west, the road to Carentan turned into a series of small debts we would have to pay in the dark. We stayed at the slot because the slot was what we had left, and because the only thing worse than being here was going outside to see how large the problem had become. The horizon did not recede. It kept arriving. And the wall which we had once described as a place now behaved like a task list that refused to finish. The difference between plans and days is reliability. On paper, every part obeys. In salt and grit, only the parts that can be abused without failing still matter. By afternoon, we understood why their system kept moving even when individual pieces died in front of us. It was not luck. It was training married to simple hardware and a doctrine that treated failure as an expected step, not an endpoint. Start with the men who carried radios. We had good wire buried deep, but a single landslide of earth from a near miss turned a regiment into islands. Our backup sets were precious trained operators, scarcer still, and our net discipline assumed calm that the beach refused to provide. Their forward teams came ashore with sets in the first waves, then more in the second, each tuned to the same grammar: say little, say it clearly, say it again if you must, and expect steel to answer. You could hear the difference in the way the salvos behaved. Barrages that had once come like weather now arrived like decisions walked 20 yards to the left, when a panel tilt told them to lengthen 100, when a handset murmured, stopped when smoke was enough. A bunker that kept firing could still die in silence if its cable had been pinched under a fallen beam. A bunker with a voice could pull a ship's attention off its roof for just long enough to live. Our survival increasingly depended on who could still speak. Then the engineers whose reliability looked like stubbornness. We had assumed mine belts and obstacles would remain problems until a specialist crew under calm conditions solved them. Their tools, flails, Bangalore's hose charges, cutters were built to function at good enough in the worst possible place. A flail whose drum stuttered or shed chains still cleared a lane wider than a man's fear. A Bangalore pushed only halfway under wire still tore a mouth big enough for 4 rifles to pass. The tools were crude in ways that made them honest. Sand and water that fouled fine mechanisms could not confuse a chain beating a pattern into the earth. When the first team failed, the second had watched the failure, adjusted the angle, and tried again. Reliability for them was not "this machine never breaks." It was "the next attempt happens before the last failure can matter." Armor 2 was trained in varieties. We had built counters for tanks on roads and tanks on ramps. We could hit both. The canvas-skirted swimmers were less a surprise than a tempo problem. You had to decide whether to spend a gun's minute on the improbable in water or the inevitable on sand. Their crews had drilled not on perfect crossings, but on recovery. Drop the screen, fast fight, as a normal tank inherit a gap an engineer had purchased with a scar. When one drowned the next behind, it did not pause to mourn. When one reached the beach and threw a track on a buried obstacle, the infantry peeled off its flanks as if the wreck were a planned barricade. None of this looked graceful. All of it worked enough. Air power wrote its own reliability into our day by making movement conditional. You could take a road once by luck. You could not take it twice without being seen. Fighter bombers did not have to kill a column to break its schedule. They had to force it off the road, into hedges, under trees, where every halt turned into a meeting about fuel spacing and the next dash. Our doctrine for releasing armor upward sensible in peacetime now kept speed locked inside signatures that the sky could read. On the ground, training answered with dispersion drills, camouflage bursts of sprinting that resembled panic but were actually practice. Yet every practiced halt surrendered minutes, and minutes were what their engineers were turning into exits. Artillery was the truth teller. Our batteries could still punish anything they saw. But seeing had become a privilege. Periscopes blurred under shock. Spire observers lost their steps to dust. Church towers that gave perfect angles gave perfect targets. Their counter-battery loop observer to ship to corrected fire ran faster than our repair loop runner to cable fault to splice. Even when our mathematics was flawless, the conversation could be lost because someone else owned the interval between corrections. Reliability here meant not that guns never faltered, but that their feedback arrived while the same crew was still at the same instrument. Too often, it did not. Fuel and ammunition exposed the quiet side of doctrine. A wall looks self-sufficient until you count belts and boxes. The MG-42 will devour roughly 200 rounds per minute, whether the runner is brave or not. Cooling pauses and barrel swaps are rituals that rob a minute, no matter how much you love the gun. A casemate with 4,000 rounds feels rich at dawn, and poor by noon if its resupply path crosses a lane currently being argued over by ships. Our logistics assumed time in which men could lift, carry, breathe, repeat. Theirs assumed loss and so pushed supplies on a schedule rather than in reaction to need. LSTs nosed close when surf allowed. Rhino ferries shoved pallets ashore. Beach groups corralled heaps of everything into dumps that looked chaotic, until the right hand reached in and found exactly the next thing. If a pile took a hit, another pile already existed 20 yards away. It was not neat. It was present. Training revealed itself in the way small units made the same choices without central permission. At Omaha, we watched squads behave as if they had rehearsed our particular angles, hugging the right-hand shadow of a stake line, pausing at the exact lip where our traverse stiffened, throwing smoke low so it crawled rather than drifted. No one needed a speech. A corporal performed the old solution, and the private next to him copied. Our strong points held wherever our own habits aligned with today. Short bursts tracked targets, not men, shift lanes on timers, not on nerves. They failed where the day asked for initiative outside the manual, and we still sought permission up the ladder. Doctrine was the last and best explanation. We had bet on place thickness, position-calibrated arcs. They had bet on process phases executed in parallel with redundancy. When a neat plan meets a redundant process, the plan wins battles, and the process wins days. You could feel that truth in the dugout as much as at the embrasure. A report that should have been tragedy lane cleared only stayed tragic if it was singular. When the next two lines read second lane opened and exit tested, our local victory turned into a story with an inevitable next page. Even their mistakes came written with rehearsed remedies. A company short on Bangalore's turned to hose charges. A tank that could not mount a dune called for a petard mortar from a Churchill that specialized in rude answers. We answered and were right, and still lost the minute that mattered. By evening, the word we had stolen from a prisoner would not leave our mouths. Schedule. The beach had become one: engineers buying minutes for infantry, infantry buying minutes for tanks, buying minutes for the next roadblock inland. We still owned patches of ground, and our guns still ruled any sight line that luck left intact. But the fight no longer asked which pillbox stood. It asked whether we could interrupt a rhythm being kept by ships, sappers, sergeants, and watchful aircraft working from the same simple sheet of music. Reliability in that sense was not the immortality of parts. It was the certainty that something would arrive in the next 10 minutes, even if the thing before it had just died. And we had not built our morning for that kind of certainty. By late afternoon, the day narrowed to a single measurement that we could feel in our teeth. It was not the thickness of concrete or the angle of an embrasure. It was distance and time destroyers daring to close to roughly 1,000 yards, and salvos shifting in under a minute when a steady voice ashore asked them to. When that loop tightened, the wall's arithmetic failed. The roof over us still weighed what it weighed, The embrasure still framed its careful slice of world, but the conversation from beach to ship to impact now ran faster than a crew could swap a barrel or a runner could bring the next two belts. We had been fighting a place. Suddenly, we were fighting a metronome. The signs arrived first as absences. A strong point to our left that had been spitting all day became a hole in the soundscape, no bang, just missing syllables. Another position that had been coughing dust at predictable intervals began coughing it at cruel ones, the corrections walking in as if someone had learned our breathing and chosen to land between the breaths. The loader tapped my shoulder, and I felt shame at the flinch. The tap was a ritual, not a warning, but the rhythm of it had started to line up with the ship's. We stitched a lane that had sprouted out of nothing, watched figures flatten, saw the flail behind them slow and shudder, and prepared the old relief of a lane closing. Instead, the smoke thickened, the salvos stepped left by the length of a panel, and the lane lived again before the last casing stopped ringing on the casemate floor. Then we realized why the map on the trestle table looked increasingly like a chest rising and falling. The exits off Omaha had learned to exist not as triumphs, but as intervals. A path would be punched open by sappers inherited by a platoon that moved at the exact speed its radios allowed and briefly held by a tank that did not care if it was pretty so long as it was present. If one exit choked, another kept time for it. We punished one track as it dared the bluff, and 5 minutes later, a twin silhouette tried again, one hedgerow over, not bravely, but correctly. The feeling was indecently simple. They had stopped asking whether a particular gate would stand and started counting how many minutes would pass before any gate did. On the Caen road, the counterstroke that had lived all spring on our briefing slides finally touched daylight and the sea, and we wanted to believe the day still had a hinge. Elements of our panzers pushed far enough to see surf at Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer, and reports came in with a taste like water after salt. But every kilometer north had been purchased at the price of being visible. Fighter bombers arrived in squadrons, not warnings. Naval guns wrote their veto into the verges. The tanks turned back not because their crews lacked nerve, but because exposure multiplied faster than courage could amortize it. The counterattack had reached the coastline measured in meters. The enemy owned the coastline measured in minutes. In the embrasure, the human version of the inflection was smaller and crueler. A sapper with a handset stood where any man would die and did not. He lifted the aerial long enough to say something short. Our roof answered before we did. We raked the spot and he ceased to exist, but the correction he had called was already in the air, and the next sapper knelt in the same depression, wearing the same calm as if the death had been the plan. A belt ended. The loader's hands knew the ritual without looking. The new belt seated with that compact metallic sigh that has always comforted gunners. The comfort lasted exactly as long as the next salvo took to arrive. Men began to talk less in nouns and more in numbers. One bunker chief face powdered like a miller from pulverized concrete said, "We could hold this lane for 6 minutes on remaining belts if the water stayed down and the barrels did not demand their pause." Another man in the dugout gambled that the next runner from the dump could make it in 4 if he was lucky with the angles, and if the ships chose someone else to dislike for a moment. Luck did not scale. Physics did. The shells that mattered came from hulls close enough to embarrass our doctrine, and they were steered by a grammar we had not learned. If a panel tilted left 20 yards, the iron moved left 20 yards. If smoke crept instead of drifted, the salvos lengthened not in panic, but in comprehension. Inside the casemate, the wall proved both everything and nothing. 2 meters of reinforced roof still shrugged splinters. A careful shot from the 8.8 still rewrote a lane with the same impartiality it had shown all morning. The MG-42 still ate its way through a minute at roughly 1/200 rounds, no matter what hymn we sang at it. But none of that touched the loop that had become the day's verdict, a voice 1,000 yards less than a minute. The shorter the loop got, the smaller our world became until the only choices that felt like choices were the ones you could make between one shell's arrival and the next. We sent a runner anyway, because armies are built on faith as much as on steel. He went low along a line of stakes that had started the morning proud and now leaned like men who had thought too hard. The ships were speaking to someone else when he crossed the wide, and he made it to the dump with a speed that would have qualified him for any sport in peacetime. Coming back, he learned what the rest of us had learned: intervals are not mercy. A correction walked in, tossed him sideways with the sand, and left him in a posture that said the belts he carried were now abstractions. Another runner already knew he was next, because that was how the day was being kept. There were still local victories that felt like photographs. A flail's drum jammed, and we took its crew prisoner hands up. Faces salted white, looking too tired to understand the safety they had just earned. A lane collapsed under properly timed fire and stayed dead for 3 full minutes, which in the afternoon felt like a kind of wealth. A forward observation post at a church spire found a battery of its own friends and persuaded it to speak at the right target for once. None of these removed the metric that had replaced hope. When destroyers stood off at about 1,000 yards under cover of smoke, and answers shifted in the time it takes a man to reload the question, the day asked did not change. Then we realized the outcome had already been written at noon, and we were only learning to read it at dusk. The enemy had assembled a system whose weakest parts could die without interrupting the next 10 minutes. We had assembled a fortress whose strongest parts could hold without changing the next 10 minutes. You could feel the distinction in your shoulders. Their losses hurt them in weight. Ours hurt us in sequence. The difference is small on a map and final in a ledger. Toward nightfall, the smoke thinned enough to turn the sun into a harmless coin again. Offshore engines kept a patient hum that explained tomorrow. Inland hedgerows began their other work, turning broad war into a series of short conversations at 30 to 60 meters where courage has a smell and fatigue has a sound. We closed the log for the hour and wrote what any honest officer would write: enemy lodgements established, landings continuous, counterstrokes constrained by air and fire from sea, radios intermittent, ammunition adequate for now, schedule unfavorable. It was a tidy paragraph about an untidy truth. We went back to the slot because there was nowhere else to go. The belt lifted. The bolt ran. The sight gave us the same stubborn rectangle of surf and motion it had given all day. Somewhere a destroyer trimmed 20 yards left, and somewhere a man with a handset listened for how long it took the answer to arrive. That interval, not our thickness, was the battle now, and it was shorter than our courage. Night did not empty the sea. It only hid the count. Offshore, a patient humming laid a ceiling over the dark, and each time the surf paused, we could hear engines trading places beyond sight, ferrying more minutes toward the shore. Inland, the hedgerows took the day's broad decisiveness and broke it into short sentences spoken at 30 to 60 meters, where breath and courage have the same temperature. We learned the new grammar: quickly move when the planes are elsewhere, speak only when the wire is alive, and measure hope in the space between 2 salvos rather than in the thickness over your head. The logbook for the last hour said what the morning had been: circling lodgements held along the Norman coast, landings continuous, counterstrokes shaped by air, and the guns from sea, ammunition sufficient in some sectors, stingy in others, radios intermittent, schedule unfavorable. That word schedule had become the hinge of everything. We had built a wall to command ground. They had brought a method to command time. Where a plan wins a sector, a method wins the day, and days are what decide months. No officer would write that in ink before midnight. Every man who had stood in an embrasure could feel it through the steel. We walked the lanes we still owned and counted what the morning had cost. A flail tank sat with its drum frozen like a stalled clock. Its crew drank water with the blank politeness of men who had been spared by paperwork. Boxes of belts that felt rich at dawn looked thin by lamplight. A runner's path across the open lay recorded in scuffed sand and dark punctuation, the script of a duty that had ended mid-sentence. The 8.8 still waited with the patient arrogance of physics. The MG still promised to eat at roughly 1,200 rounds in the next minute if anyone asked it to sing. The roof still shrugged pebbled rain from splinters. But no number in the casemate could lengthen the interval between a steady voice on the beach and the answer from a hull that had crept in to within 1,000 yards. The shorter that interval, the smaller our world. Orders for tomorrow arrived, as if tomorrow could be made obedient. Hold the exits, we can see, contest the ones we cannot anchor on the hedges and the ditches where air must guess and ships must wait for a call that may not come. Shift batteries that can still move. Splice any wire that will listen. Disperse the columns that must travel so that an observation becomes an inconvenience instead of an obituary. None of it was heroism. All of it was work. In that there was comfort. Work is what soldiers do when prophecy fails. We tried to close the day the way we had opened it, by believing that thickness and angles could impose a will on water. But the horizon had taught us a different lesson. The enemy did not need a perfect lane, only a living one. Not a flawless hour, only a continuous one. If we could not break the rhythm, we would be forced to fight inside it, hedgerow to hedgerow, orchard to orchard, until attrition replaced strategy, and the coast became a memory told in past tense. In the last light, a ship trimmed 20 yards left, and somewhere a man with a handset decided whether that was enough. We blew out the lamp, not to save fuel, but to think in the dark. The sea kept its patient humming. The fields kept their short sentences. The wall kept its promises wherever men kept theirs. And across the waterline, the same message repeated in salt and iron, the line we had written at dawn and could not erase by dusk. We report targets from horizon to surf, and our sectors cannot hold contact everywhere at once.